Persona 3 is really two games. It's half JRPG dungeon crawler and half Japanese high school student friendship dating simulator / visual novel. The main character is a silent protagonist, an orphan transfer student enrolling in a new school in the year 2009. Shortly after arriving in his new dormitory, he discovers a dark hour occurs every night at midnight, during which most humans are frozen in coffins and unaware of their surroundings, and evil shadows patrol the world. You and your fellow students are tasked with uncovering the mystery of the shadows, which requires exploring an evil tower called Tartarus that appears above the high school during the dark hour. Each character has access to a magical persona, which is kind of like a job or a class in other RPGs. It modifies your stats and provides you with abilities. The main character has the unique ability to collect multiple personae, and you can switch between them. Your allies' personae are fixed, they cannot be changed. So the game progresses through 300 real-world calendar days, starting in April 2009 and ending in January 2010. Some of the days are passed automatically, but you're given free time to make choices on about 200 of those days, with significant cutscenes, dialogue, or events on most of the remaining 100 or so days. On each school day, the player automatically attends class, which often includes a lecture cutscene and pop quiz from the teacher. You're then allowed to choose one after-school activity. These activities include making friends, studying, developing your social stats, visual novel, dating simulator type stuff. This part of the game is mostly separate from the JRPG portion, although progressing friendships with key characters does increase your ability to breed better persona for the combat half of the game, so you can't neglect it if you're really just trying to play it for combat. Each of the characters you can make friends with develops a social link, it's called in-game, and as the social link becomes stronger, you can breed stronger persona of a certain type. After your after-school activity plays out, it becomes evening, where you get to make one more choice. You can either choose a second social activity, so maybe find a night owl to hang out with and progress their social link, or you can choose to explore the dungeon Tartarus. Now, Tartarus is a randomly generated dungeon full of enemies and treasure chests. As you win battles in Tartarus, your characters accrue fatigue, although that value is hidden from the player. You just know when they're fatigued, you don't know how fatigued they are before that status triggers. When your characters are too fatigued, they're unable to fight. The game strongly urges you to stop exploring Tartarus when your characters are too tired to keep fighting. Fatigue characters have to rest for a few days without entering the dungeon before they can recover, so you can't do Tartarus every single night if you're playing it until everyone gets fatigued. As you reach special threshold floors, you fight difficult bosses. Reaching one of those boss floors unlocks a checkpoint you can automatically warp to instead of climbing the tower from the first floor, so thankfully it lets you save before attempting bosses. Your ability to progress in Tartarus is gated, though, by main story events, and those events only progress as the main calendar moves forward. So the top floor you can reach increases as a function of the main story. You can't just grind in Tartarus forever. About once per in-game month, there's this unique story event that happens, completely separate from the Tartarus dungeon crawl. Sometimes it involves a little mini-dungeon, but it always ends in a major boss fight. And these unique story events occur on preset dates, which can be predicted by the player. You have to complete these monthly story events to unlock the higher floors in Tartarus. You have to make sure you're a high enough level to handle these mandatory monthly story events, so you have to grind for experience points in Tartarus before they begin. As far as a typical 2-hour session, because Persona 3 is split pretty much down the middle between exploring Tartarus and simulating life as a Japanese high school student, it's actually kind of tough to say what any given 2-hour session might look like. It's very possible that you'll spend an entire 2 hours in Tartarus grinding for XP against regular enemies, maybe fighting a boss or two to unlock new checkpoints. The problem is because weak enemies award significantly less XP, and since your further progression through Tartarus is gated by the calendar date, eventually it's not going to be worth your time to keep grinding because the enemies just don't give enough experience points anymore. You'll reach a pretty natural point where it makes sense to use your evenings for social activities instead of going back to Tartarus. You'll probably move to a more typical 2-hour session being spent progressing calendar days, doing social links, until the next mandatory monthly story event lets you back into Tartarus at the higher levels. So as far as this game's cathartic milestones or major points of progression that will make you feel accomplished for having played the game, I would say that those include reaching checkpoint floors in Tartarus and defeating the bosses nearby, reaching the monthly top floor in Tartarus, which means, hey, you don't really have to stay in Tartarus much longer. You can go do social links for the rest of this month. Progressing and completing social links during the day, especially completing them, is a pretty big deal. And completing those mandatory monthly story events. Tartarus's bosses are often tuned to be grind checks, kind of like a DPS check in an MMO, a boss that really doesn't have a lot of mechanics. It's just there to make sure that you have sufficient DPS to handle the rest of the dungeon or raid. Anyway, though, as grind checks, they block your progress until you have done enough grinding in the dungeon to be able to handle them. So defeating these bosses can give you confidence that you'll be able to handle the next section of Tartarus and probably the next mandatory monthly story event once you get to the current ceiling in the dungeon. Alright, so getting into the audience, who do I think should play Persona 3? I think that this game has a fairly niche audience, although it's extremely popular in the West, surprisingly popular to me. I think that in order to really enjoy this game, you should probably both be really into anime, and particularly really into like high school anime set in the modern day, and you also really need to be into Japanese RPGs. And be okay with grindy Japanese RPGs. Grindy doesn't necessarily mean that games are bad. Dragon Quest, for example, as a series, has historically been very grindy, and those games are amazing. So if you've ever been frustrated by grind, you probably don't want to play Persona 3. If you actively dislike anime, or you actively dislike high school anime in particular, you might not be that into Persona 3. I think that if you were really, really, really into one of those categories and ambivalent about the other, so if you were really into anime and didn't really care for turn-based RPGs, you might enjoy this. And similarly, if you were really, really into difficult RPGs, you might be able to overlook the visual novel component. But I think this game really works best if both sides of that equation really speak to you as a gamer. And I think that opinion's probably informed by my focus on beating games, because this is a very long game. The base playthrough of this, so just the basic main story, or playing it as quickly as you can while doing, the necessary relevant things without really skipping major main quest content. It's about 70 hours long on the main track, and that's simply because you have to progress through every single one of 200 plus calendar days on your way to the full 300 in order to beat it. There's no way to fast track it, to move it faster. I think that if this game were significantly shorter or had an option to progress through it more quickly, I could probably recommend it to more people. But if you're not looking to beat the game, if it's not really critical for you to finish it, if you just want to check it out maybe and see if you like it, then I'd probably recommend it to more people. It's just because the base game is so long, and everyone has the backlog problem right now where, I have so many games I can play. It's so trivial to get these amazing games. Which one do I pick? Is why I give such a specific audience recommendation for this one. Let's look at the different subcategories for audience. These are different motivations for playing games. These represent different audiences. People who want achievement, for example, want to be able to beat the game. They want to collect things. They want to do everything there is to do. They want to be a completionist and 100% it. What is there to achieve in Persona 3? I think Persona 3's achievements are about moving through it and beating all the bosses and completing the game. I think that that's fulfilling to do. Like I said, it does require some grinding, but it's interesting content. Those bosses are difficult to overcome and are worth, tempering your Persona build to make sure that you're able to handle them. I don't think this game is worth 100%ing. It's the sort of game that, in order to 100% it, that basically implies that you maxed out all of the social links during the day, and you probably got all of the best possible Persona in the end game and fought the optional super boss. All of those things are extremely challenging, and I don't think they're challenging in an interesting way. To max all the social links, you're almost certainly going to have to follow a guide. The way this game works, there are certain characters who will only interact with you on certain days of the week or at certain times of the day, and the calendar is broken up by all sorts of mandatory events that skip days. So you might be saying, I want to progress the social link on Tuesday. Well, surprise, Tuesday's a holiday, and your character is automatically going to do something that you couldn't have predicted a week beforehand. So I think that if you want 100% the game by maxing all the social links, you're going to have to go to Game FAQs and look up how exactly do I go about doing that, right? I personally don't get a lot of value out of that sort of completionist thing, and I would make a similar complaint about a game like Final Fantasy X, where there's a lot of cool stuff to do in that game, but the 100%ing it, like doing all the arena bosses and capturing all the monsters, I don't think is fundamentally all that fun. It's extremely grindy. Now, if this is the only JRPG that you own, and you're really in love with the characters and you want to spend as much time as you possibly can in this universe, then buckle up, because you're going to get a couple 100 hours of entertainment out of this game. I think absolutely it could appeal to you as an achievement gamer. I would look up the super boss. It's not a major spoiler, and just see the requirements to encounter it and how the battle is going to play out. Watch a YouTube video of someone fighting it. See if that would be fun for you, because for me, it doesn't seem that awesome. On the exploration side, so the game is fundamentally about exploring Tartarus, right? The problem is that every floor of Tartarus is basically the same. You can see the matrix, so to speak, pretty quickly. As you progress through new chunks of Tartarus, the music that's playing and the background changes slightly, the dungeons get slightly longer, but they all kind of follow the same rules with where the staircases to the next levels are placed, where the enemies are going to spawn, that sort of thing. You'll kind of get what Tartarus is about in a couple hours of playing through it, and it doesn't really spend a lot of time exploring that space. There are the mandatory monthly dungeons, sometimes aren't even a dungeon, it's just like a cutscene followed by a boss fight. So there's some places that are a little bit different, but from a combat exploration perspective, I don't think you're going to get a lot as an explorer from this game. And if we just ignore the design of Tartarus itself and look at what about exploration with enemies, sometimes it can be fun to see what the next enemy is going to be around the corner, or see what the next boss is. Persona, even for a JRPG, starts recycling enemy animations and models pretty early on. In fact, a lot of the bosses you're going to encounter in Tartarus are going to be recycled regular enemies that have been slightly palette swapped, which is a little disappointing. Most of the unique bosses you're going to encounter are going to be during the mandatory monthly story events, and those are still cool. Like, they're very stylish, they're neat looking, it's fun to get to them. But don't count on seeing around the corner the next crazy shadow or next shadow boss you're going to fight in Tartarus. They're all pretty samey. Even in the social link aspect of it, exploration is limited to the same 7 or 8 areas that you're going to visit repeatedly, and different events will happen in those areas, but it's not common that you're going to see just a completely brand new map. Now, exploration doesn't need to mean areas, maps, zones, that sort of thing. It could also be people and characters, and that is where Persona 3 does shine. There are a lot of characters to meet, a ton of social links to progress, and even beyond the social links, a lot of other characters like the other party members that are with you at the dorm, to explore their backstory and learn more about them. So if that's the sort of thing that would draw you to this game, finding out all these people that live in the town, seeing how it's a living town, and seeing their story arcs play out, I think that would satisfy an explorer if you're a social explorer, so to speak. Now, flavor, I'm going to break up into 3 things, I think, here. We're going to talk about the setting in general, independent from the story, what they've set up with the persona and the shadows and that sort of thing. We're going to talk about the characters in the universe, and we're going to talk about the actual storyline with no spoilers. So on the setting side, this game is super cool. Like, the whole idea of you shoot yourself in the head with a gun to summon this spooky ghost monster that's inside your body, and you use it to cast spells and fight enemies. It's pretty cool. It has that, if you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, you watch that movie and it makes you wonder, what if the real world is like this? What if I actually live in the Matrix? And this game is set up similarly where, what if I'm secretly in a spooky ghost coffin at night and these teenagers are fighting spooky ghosts in a spooky hell tower that has replaced my high school in my town? Like, that's a cool idea. So it's a really cool setting to think about. It would be a fun place to set a tabletop RPG, I guess is how I think about settings. Would it be a fun place to do some tabletop and RP in there? So I think that it's very flavorful in that respect, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the style and polish section. I mentioned earlier that I feel like Japanese RPGs tend to be about exploring characters, building up characters, giving them arcs, less about overarching plot, and I think that that's true for Persona 3. It spends a lot of its time on the characters. In fact, a huge chunk of your playtime is going to be progressing characters' social links, which means talking with them, lots of dialogue, lots of backstory, nearly all of it voice acted. There's very little in this game that isn't voice acted, so you can view it as like a movie or a visual novel in that respect, and I think that the characters are really well fleshed out. and believable as people in most cases. A lot of my issues with the flavor in this game and with the characters has to do with the hypersexualization of its female characters. It's very anime tropey in that respect. There's a couple of gratuitous sequences that the game would have been better without. One thing I didn't like was the way the social links are handled from a video game perspective and how they're scored and rated. Essentially, you have your protagonist is silent, and he still has an attitude, which is kind of interesting. You don't play too many games with a silent protagonist where the main character still has a personality that arises naturally from the sorts of dialogue options you get. I think that's a cool idea. Unfortunately, the kind of character the protagonist is an asshole. He's dismissive, he's rude, he's selfish, he's not very likable. And if your fantasy in this game is to interact with these characters in this high school simulator the way you would interact with those people if they were real, you're going to get punished for trying to play up on that fantasy. Often you won't get the dialogue option that you want if you don't want to be a jerk. And often the game rewards you for making deplorable decisions in the social link conversation. So as an example, there's a really early social link in the game where you're dealing with a friend at school who's trying to date his ethics teacher. And I don't have a problem with that being included as a topic to explore. In fact, I think that's a great topic to explore. There aren't going to be many games or even movies that deal with that. I'm impressed that Persona 3 went to the trouble of including it. My problem is the way that the social link is adjudicated. Basically, each time you have a social link conversation with a character, you're given different dialogue choices to select. And there's always one choice the game has decided is the better choice in progressing this link that gives you more points towards progressing their friendship. And so often the choice it picks for you, the one that's the correct thing to do to make the person happy, is pretty deplorable. In the case of this one, it's that you have to support this kid as he tries to date his ethics teacher. And I think if they had kept the social links working exactly the same way, except they didn't award more or fewer points based on which option you selected, I wouldn't have a problem with it. Then I could, live out the fantasy of playing this game and pretending like I'm actually the protagonist and this is how I'd actually respond to these characters. But by making it video gamey and saying, no, this is the answer that we want you to pick, this is the answer we feel is correct, the developers are injecting a narrative into the story. They're saying, this is how you should be dealing with this person. I think when you're dealing with complex social topics like that, you need to be more careful not to make such obvious comments on what's right and what's wrong, right? And I think that the rule about going to the actual story of the game, the overarching plot, the rule with Japanese RPGs being less plot-focused and more character-focused, that is true by 10 orders of magnitude in Persona 3. I think that the actual plot of this game is pretty paper-thin. At this point, when we're recording this video, I've also played Shin Megami Tensei Digital Devil Saga, which was very similar. Like, the beginning of the game is pretty meaty when you're first learning about Tartarus and the shadows and all that. The end of the game is really meaty, and the end of the game is really cool. Like, I wish that more of the game was like the last 30 days or so of this one. It's really flavorful, and you're really feeling the impact of the story up to that point. But if I were to try to summarize the plot of Persona 3 to you without talking about the characters in any way and how they behave, if I was just saying this is what happens, I could probably tell it to you in about 2 minutes, and about a minute and a half would be the last 30 days of the in-game time. So if you're in this for overarching plot and a satisfying story that goes through multiple acts, I don't think you want to play Persona. You want to be in this game because you want to know about the trivialities of the day-to-day life of a Japanese high school student and the friendships that he makes along the way. Not so much the fantasy, dark modern fantasy plot of the shadows and Tartarus and what's going on there. So from a mechanics perspective, we talked a little bit already about the mechanics of social links in the flavor section. I think they're a little too intertwined to separate them out. So I guess we should focus more on the combat mechanics of the game. I, for one, really like the fatigue system. If you're going to have a game that has this dungeon crawler element, you need to do something to stop me from just spending all of my time in the dungeon. And having the fatigue system that says, okay, you've played enough, is a natural stopping point for the player to leave and go do the other half of the game, the social link part. I think in a similar way to where I think that if your game's going to have a durability system, most of your weapons should be very fragile. I think that's also true for this fatigue system. As the game progresses, fatigue becomes less and less of an issue, where towards the end of the game, it almost never comes up. You can spend hours in Tartarus before it comes up and interrupts you, which is convenient at the time, but really it's just pushing you to grind more and more, and it's creating that problem I talked about in the 2-hour session, where it's splitting your sessions between, am I spending this whole time grinding? Am I spending this whole time doing social links? When I think the dream, the developer intent is that you do a little bit of Tartarus, a little bit of social link, and so on. So fatigue's a cool idea. I would like to see iteration on it. I'm sure that it gets iterated on a bit in Persona 4 and 5. From a combat perspective, Persona has some cool ideas. It's a spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei's press turn system. In that game, if you use an ability an enemy is weak against or you critically hit them, you get some extra turns and the enemy loses some turns. And the same thing works vice versa when the enemies are attacking you. There's a lot of strategy built around maximizing press turns to be immune to the sorts of elements enemies are using and to use elements enemies are weak against to end combats as quickly as possible and to reduce the amount of damage that you're taking. Persona simplifies that by removing the turns and partial turns that you gain or lose, and simply making a character get knocked down if they're hit by something they're weak against. In the knockdown status, you've effectively just lost your turn. That applies to enemies as well. It has a neat side mechanic where if you knock down all enemies, you get to use this special all-out attack that does a lot of damage to everyone. The problem, though, I think, is at the end of the day, this system feels a lot of fun when the player is doing it, and it doesn't feel fun at all. It's anti-fun when the enemy does it to you, in a way that I don't think was true in the only Shin Megami Tensei game I've played, Digital Devil Saga. It was still frustrating to have your enemies take turns away from you in that game, but it felt like something that you could plan around and build around, whereas it feels really uninteractive in Persona. For example, if you miss with an attack in Persona 3, your character is knocked down. So not only did you just waste that character's action, you've also wasted their next action. And yeah, there are abilities that your party members can use to pick somebody up from being knocked down, but now you're just transferring whose action got wasted. There are many, many times in this game, and I've had people on stream telling me that this is pretty true for the SMT series in general, but many times where it's possible an enemy will get a preemptive strike against you or use a critical hit on its first attack and knock you down and then just wreck you on the next turn, and there's nothing you can do about it. I think it should be a key design goal of games like this that you be able to respond to information, that you be able to have a chance to save yourself if you're going to die. One-shot kills are generally not terribly fun. And it's especially atrocious in Persona 3 because of two problems. One, if the main character dies, the game is over. I mean, you have allies that have access to resurrection magic and resurrection items, but it doesn't matter. If the main character dies, it's GG. And two, the game over condition is that you have to load your last save. You don't even get to restart with experience or items you've gained with some sort of penalty. You have to load your last save. It's over. You just lost, an hour, 2 hours of progress, depending on the last time you popped at a save point. So I think that those things combined kind of contribute to a playstyle where everyone who plays Persona 3 is probably going to play it exactly the same way, which is too bad. It's got all this perceived complexity in the number of persona that you can equip and the builds you can create. But at the end of the day, protecting the protagonist is paramount because his death leads to the end of the game. And to make things worse, in the version that I played, I didn't play the PSP remake, I played FES. You can only control the protagonist. You can't control your allies. You can give them mild tactical commands like try to heal or try to knock enemies down, but they don't really obey them. They give you enough control over them for it to be frustrating that you don't get direct control over them. So if your player character is the only character that you know can reliably remove status effects and heal party members, you pretty much have to play the main character as a healer. And not only do you have to play him as a healer, but you have to focus all your effort on healing the main character so that he doesn't die and cause a game over. This makes it extra frustrating if your main character gets knocked down for any reason. If you do try to attack with him and he misses, or he gets hit by an element he's weak against, you're basically watching a cutscene for the next couple minutes of battle because you don't get to control your allies as you wait for your main character to get back up. So the battles are among the least interactive battles I've played in a JRPG for that reason. I think that if you played the PSP version, or if you skipped Persona 3 and started with Persona 4, you wouldn't have that big of a problem. But it is an issue in the original release of this game. One last comment on the subject of mechanics. There's a idea in this game that's similar to the DPS check in MMOs. I mentioned this much earlier when talking about the summary of the game. These are bosses that you will run into that essentially exist to make sure that you have certain abilities before you progress further into Tartarus. So, for example, there's a boss that if you don't have the ability that lets you heal your entire party with one action, you will probably die. And it makes sense. Like, it's good to have this heal check boss to make sure that you have that skill, because the upcoming regular enemies elsewhere in Tartarus are going to expect that you have it. I'm totally behind the design decision in including it. The problem is this idea called time to death. We talk about this on stream a little bit. It's an MMO concept that if you're fighting a raid boss that's going to take you 15 minutes to defeat, and you make an error in the first 2 minutes that is guaranteed to kill you 10 minutes later, it shouldn't kill you 10 minutes later. It should kill you right now. You don't want your raid group to be limping to failure, to spend 15 minutes wasting their time when they've already lost, 10 minutes ago. If you make that mistake, you want the battle to end. And with Persona 3, these boss fights that I'm talking about that are basically heal checks, they take about 30-40 minutes to complete, and you're probably not going to die until you get them down to the last 10% of their health, where they start using the abilities that are going to wipe you. So it's going to look like I might be able to struggle and limp through and make this, when in reality you were dead before you even started the battle, because you didn't have access to the all heal ability. So a better way to do that, I think, would be to have the boss open with an attack that reduces everyone's health to 1, and then immediately follow up with an attack that does 1 damage to everyone, right? That says you need to do something that heals everyone back up to full. But not save that super move for the end of the fight. Now, as we jump into style and polish, I know I've been pretty negative about this game so far, but I can't deny that Persona 3 is an extremely stylish and incredibly polished game. The UI in this game is gorgeous. The way the UI works in the battle system, the way it works with social links, it's all very stylish and stands out. If you really like style and polish in your games, I think that Persona is a great example, especially if you're into anime and particularly high school anime. It feels like you're playing one. There's these FMV cutscenes that occur in the game that are traditional 2D anime, and they look so much worse than the actual game, which is crazy. You usually expect the FMVs to look amazing compared to the main game, but I don't think it's because those cutscenes are particularly bad. It's because the main game looks so good and so clean and so well done. Almost all of the important characters have special portraits with different animations for different emotions they might be feeling. Like I said, basically the entire game is voice acted. It really feels like they put a lot of work into making this game look the way it does. So if you're an art aficionado, especially an anime aficionado, then you should definitely play Persona 3. My last audience category is hype, and that's how excited are you to talk about this game with other people? What's driving you to the forums to discuss what's going on in the game and what you did in the game? And I don't think I'm the best person to consult on this subject, because I am routinely flabbergasted at how popular it is to watch this game. To my mind, I would think this game wouldn't be exciting to talk about, because your typical session playing the game is you're either grinding or you're doing social links. And the social links are set up so that there's one correct answer on each social link path. So there's not even like, oh, how did you talk to this character? It's like, no. Like, oh, I picked the correct option for this character when I talk to them, right? I guess you have choices as far as which social links you progress in the early game, so you might be excited to talk about which characters you've talked to and what persona you've crafted. But like I said, with the combat in the game kind of pushes you towards making a character that's focused on healing and keeping yourself alive and keeping the party alive. So even though you might have a cool set of personae, it really quickly becomes clear what the correct persona to use in most situations is. So I don't think there's a lot to discuss there. The plot itself is pretty paper thin. Like I said, maybe people want to find out your reaction to the different characters, because everybody has their favorite character in this game that they want to talk about. I think this game is definitely a hype-filled game because it's very popular on Twitch. It has, among my videos on YouTube right now, some of the most views I've had in any one part 1 video. So there are definitely people on YouTube who are searching for Persona playthroughs. Many of them who get pretty upset partway through when I start skipping cutscenes. And you see things like Persona 5 was recently released when I'm recording this video, and there's just all these posts on Reddit in just generic, like the PlayStation 4 subreddit, talking about how amazing Persona is. So this really resonates with people when they really like to talk about it. I don't really know what it is they're talking about, since it's not a game where I can see a lot of variance in play style and a lot of variance in the way you experience the story, and very few like holy shit moments that you want to tune in for. It doesn't have the classic Final Fantasy VII Disc 1, Disc 2 swap where you want to see someone's reaction, right? The core events of the game aren't generally that exciting, and they're usually pretty well telegraphed. But this game is popular, and if someone wants to go in the YouTube comments and explain why you think Persona is popular, I would love to hear it. I just don't think that I'm the right person to speculate on that. Well, let's talk about whether I think Persona 3 is an important game. It looks like it's definitely important within its own franchise, right? And I don't mean that jokingly. You can look at Final Fantasy as well, where Final Fantasy IV really establishes what Final Fantasy is going to be about after that game. Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 do a lot of experiments, but 4 really solidifies this is the kind of story progress to expect, this is the sort of mechanics in battle to expect, and each of the games after that kind of follow that model. I think it's the same thing that Persona 3 sort of sets the stage for 4 and 5, but I don't think that it's really affected the rest of the genre, the JRPG genre. I don't see a lot of people trying to make Persona-like games where you have this weird hybrid of visual novel, dating simulator, and an RPG. And that's probably okay. I think that plays into it being more of a niche title. And it's cool that they're making this series that has such a specific audience. People that want to play both a grindy JRPG and do this high school life simulator side of the equation. I think this game is strongest in its presentation of, the daily life of a Japanese high school student. In fact, I think the game may have played better if it just didn't have a JRPG component at all, if it was just a friendship simulator and they focused all of their resources on that. There are definitely games like that. There are tons of visual novel games that I think that people love to play. So it really confounds me that it needed to also be a JRPG at the same time. I already went into a lot of opportunities for improvement in the audience section, so I'm not going to repeat a lot of that. I do think, though, that Persona 3 is trying something really novel. It's doing something for the first time. It has a lot of ideas. I think that there's a good intent behind not letting you control your party members. It's trying to build up on this theme of friendship and relying on your friends to help you out, and you really just being the main character and hoping that they will get your back. I think just the problem is that a lot of ideas like that don't work on the first try, and you have to iterate on them to get them to work. Sometimes that involves removing the mechanic entirely, like we see with the not being able to control your allies. That was even fixed in a PSP remake before Persona 4 even came out. So I'm excited to see the series iterate on the ideas that were established in Persona 3. I'm really hopeful for the Persona 4 playthrough that we're going to be starting soon. See what gets changed there. As far as just a mild complaint about the game, it was pretty frustrating when I was playing it. One of the things you can do is you can fuse your personas together, and when you do that, the resulting persona inherits abilities from its parents. You can trivially re-roll what abilities it inherits by just backing out of the menu and going back into it, and you can keep doing that over and over. And I think that from a game design perspective, if something is trivial to do but frustrating, it should just be made automatic, right? So here it's trivial to back out of the menu and reroll the abilities. They should just let you pick which abilities you want the persona to have. And I understand that Persona 4 actually takes that step and does that. It says, okay, we're just going to let you pick the abilities that it inherits. Because you can technically do that, you just have to be willing to be patient for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes until the right random roll shows up. So yeah, I think that generally opportunities for improvement, just iterate on what's already there. I think it'll be interesting to see my Persona 4 review to see how I feel about how that game has progressed from this game. And here we're going to do a spoiler divider. If you want to avoid spoilers, now's your chance to tune out. And we're back. So Persona 3's standout moments to me, really the biggest standout moment, I think, is the end of the game, the last 30 days, when it becomes apparent that the end of the world is coming. Suddenly, the main overarching plot of the game starts to intersect with the characters. Up until that point, you're going to Tartarus every night, you have these regular full moon events where you're going in these dungeons and fighting these creatures. But the main cast of characters barely ever talks about how this affects their lives. They're mostly going on about their day-to-day life, high school life, studying for exams, that sort of thing. And that's a cool idea. Like, Joss Whedon is one of my favorite creators. He does a great job of putting you into a fantastical universe and making it seem mundane. It can be used well for comedy. It can be used well for tragedy, surprise, drama. But I feel like in Persona 3, it feels mostly like it's two totally different games. Like, you're this different character in this different cast. It's going into Tartarus at night and on the full moon events. And then you have this completely separate high school life leading up to then. But the last 30 days is very different. Suddenly, everyone is being faced with existential dread. They're talking about, why do I keep living? Why do I keep doing what I'm doing? The end of the world is coming. I would have loved for that to have come up much sooner in the game and been dealt with much sooner in the game. It was pretty cool, though, how it contrasted to everything else. The music becomes less upbeat. The tone of the conversations is more and more of a downer. I think it fit what the combat half of the game was going for. And that's part of why I say I think the game may have worked better if it had just been a visual novel and just leave out the combat section so you're not having this weird tone whiplash whenever you go to Tartarus and then come back home. Now, this game's equivalent of the Final Fantasy VII disc swap holy shit moment is when Shinji dies, and that moment does stick with me in my mind. I think it was a good way to let him go. He was a pretty nihilistic character up to that point. He didn't seem to want to have much reason for living, so letting him sacrifice himself in service of saving one of the other characters and moving to the story, I think was a good decision. For whatever reason, I didn't really feel for Shinji since we didn't spend a lot of time getting to know him. I almost wish they would have introduced him sooner or made him more critical to the plot, which kind of ties into my general thoughts and issues about the end of the game. So there's another character we meet at the very end of the game named Ryoji, and it turns out that he's the avatar of death or something. You meet him, you herd out with him a little bit, and then you very quickly find out that he's the avatar of a bad guy, even though he's your friend. And your party members are very stricken by this, even though we just met this character. I think this could have worked a lot better if the player character was in that role, and maybe we lost control of him at the end of the story, or one of the other characters we knew longer in the game filled that role so that we could feel sad. But since we just met him, he was so conspicuous when he first showed up that I didn't really feel any connection to us meeting him and then immediately losing him, right? They could have invested by, instead of having this character show up on the protagonist's bed, talking to him every night, where it's just this creepy kid that's progressing this weird social link. He actually is a fellow student that joins the school at the same time as you do, and you spend more of the game characterizing him and getting to know him. I think one of the biggest missed opportunities in this game is the Strega team. They feel like they're an anime filler edition. There's like an extra season of the Persona 3 TV show that deals with this weird group of teenagers who are kind of dicks. They don't really feel connected to the main plot. The main guy, Takaya, or as we jokingly referred to him on stream, Budget Jesus, because he has this gun but he only ever shoots one bullet, was a frustrating dude. Like, they did a lot of build up to him. He has a couple cutscenes where he does things that you might beat him in a battle and then he'll kick your ass in cutscene. It can be pretty frustrating. But the final confrontation with him just feels really anticlimactic. It's like, really, this is the guy that has been pushing against me and causing our group so much suffering this whole time. So I think they could have done better with Budget Jesus. He could have even been the final confrontation, fought him after death, or he merges with death or something like that in the end. I think would have been a lot more interesting. And then my last issue with the game is the final boss, and oh my goodness, thank God that this didn't play out this way. So the final boss is classic JRPG. It has a ton of phases, and the game so far has been focusing on tarot cards a lot. And the cool thing with this boss is that it progresses through every single different tarot card, gaining new abilities, new weaknesses, loses weaknesses, that sort of thing. So it's a really cool fight to test your ability to adapt to whatever spells it's using. Cool idea, I'm down with it. The problem is that one of the last phases has an ability that can charm one of your party members, and if that party member has access to the full heal ability, it can give the boss a full heal. And we're talking like, an hour and a half into the fight, the boss could get a full heal, and you could have wasted your time. I just happened to luck out on stream that he never used that. People on stream told me that was a possibility. I think the only way you deal with that is to waste an hour and a half on this boss fight and waste the 30 minutes associated with cutscenes getting up to the boss fight, reload your game, go back down to an early level of Tartarus and farm for charm immunity items so that you just can't get charmed. But it's, again, that same problem I keep talking about where Persona 3's combat feels uninteractive. If that happens to you, too bad. Tough shit, you just lose. And there's nothing you can really do about it. While I like the idea of this giant, multi-phase boss fight, I think they could have worked on the implementation a little bit better to not be so nasty and cruel, especially if it's something that's going to happen 90 minutes into the fight. If you're going to do that, have the boss charm you in the first minute of the fight and force them to heal the boss so you know, okay, I need to find a way around this. And so my final thoughts on Persona 3, I'm glad that I played it. I don't think it's a game I ever would have played if we weren't streaming it, and it's certainly not a game I would have beaten if we weren't streaming it. I think that the value in the game really became apparent in the last 30 days or so of in-game calendar time, so I probably would have left with an even more negative opinion if I hadn't have finished it. I think that if you really like anime and you really like JRPGs and you don't mind grind, if you've played the Shin Megami Tensei series before, you should check out Persona 3. I think you might enjoy it despite all the things I've said in this review so far. It's a borderline meme that I didn't take too kindly to this game, and I think it just intersected with me in all the wrong ways. I didn't really care for the way the story was told or the way the combat's played out. But I think that if you're dedicated to that genre, that this is absolutely something to enjoy. If what I've said so far turns you off from the game, even though you think it might be up your alley otherwise, then I would suggest checking out Persona 3 Portable, which has a different protagonist option who sounds like is a lot more interesting than the main character in the original game. Also lets you control your party members. Or you could just skip to Persona 4, and I think that's probably the best strategy to take. Persona 4 doesn't take place in the same universe, really, as Persona 3. It's an anthology series in the same way that Final Fantasy is. So you're not missing anything by having skipped Persona 3. And my understanding is that everybody loves Persona 4. It is a critically and universally acclaimed game. Any issues that were in Persona 3 have been fixed by the time 4 comes out, and it's a very different aesthetic and storytelling style from 3. So maybe that's where you want to go. If you've never played the Persona series before, but it sounds like the premise is up your alley, if you were excited to hear what the game was about in the first section of this review when I was just describing it and then let down by the end, maybe just skip 3 and go straight to 4. Thanks, everybody. Catch you next time.